Little girl is forced to eat burned leftovers, so she calls her emergency contact. A CEO answers. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and type Amen in the comments. A beautiful piece of good news may come your way very soon, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. The burnt smell filled the cramped kitchen of the small apartment on Maple Street, where 7-year-old Rebecca Martinez stared at the charred remains of what was supposed to be dinner. Her stomach growled painfully, a sound that had become the soundtrack of her daily life as she looked at the blackened rice and overcooked vegetables scattered across the chipped plastic plate before her. The kitchen itself told the story of a family struggling to survive. Faded yellow wallpaper peeled at the corners, revealing patches of water damage from the leaky apartment upstairs. The linoleum floor was cracked and stained, covered with scratches from years of worn furniture being dragged across it. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look even more depressing than it actually was. "Eat it or starve," growled Vincent Walsh from his permanent position on the threadbare couch in the adjoining living room. His thick fingers gripped a sweating beer bottle, his fourth since getting home from his construction job 20 minutes ago. Empty bottles cluttered the coffee table that bore water rings from countless others, creating a mosaic of neglect. "I'm not wasting money on fresh food for ungrateful little brats who don't appreciate what they have." Vincent was a man who had let life's disappointments turn him cruel. At 42, his brown hair was already showing grey at the temples, and his beer belly strained against work shirts that always carried the smell of sweat and cigarettes. His face bore the permanent scowl of someone who blamed the world for his problems while taking no responsibility for his choices. Rebecca's 4-year-old sister Madison sat beside her at the small kitchen table, poking tentatively at the burnt food with a plastic fork that was cracked down the middle. Madison had inherited Vincent's brown eyes, but thankfully none of his temperament. She was a gentle soul who tried to find good in everything, even charred vegetables that tasted like ash. "Maybe if we put ketchup on it?" Madison whispered hopefully, her sweet voice barely audible above the television blaring from the living room. "We don't have ketchup, baby," Rebecca whispered back, her heart breaking at her sister's optimism. "Vincent used the last of it on his sandwich yesterday." Their 3-year-old sister Chloe sat strapped into a booster seat that had been repaired multiple times with duct tape. She was the baby of the family, with Sarah's delicate features and soft blonde curls that hung in ringlets around her cherubic face. Tears streamed down her rosy cheeks as she pushed the inedible meal away with tiny hands. "Hungry, Mama?" Chloe whimpered, reaching toward Sarah with outstretched arms. "Tummy hurts." Sarah Martinez stood in the corner of the kitchen, folding a basket of laundry that never seemed to diminish, her movements mechanical and defeated. At 29, she should have been in the prime of her life, but circumstances had aged her beyond her years. Her chestnut brown hair, once lustrous and full, now hung limp around her face, and dark circles shadowed eyes that had once sparkled with dreams and laughter. She wore a faded blue dress that had been mended multiple times, the fabric thin from countless washings in the building's basement laundromat. Her hands, once soft and graceful, now bore the calluses of endless cleaning and the small scars that came from stretching every dollar to its breaking point. "Please, Vincent," Sarah whispered, her voice barely rising above the sound of the television. "Maybe I could cook something else, something they can actually eat. I have a little money left from my cleaning job yesterday." Vincent's face darkened like a storm cloud gathering strength, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Sarah with the kind of malice that made even the children instinctively shrink back. "You questioning me, Sarah?" His voice rose with each word, the beer making him even more volatile than usual. "After everything I've done for you and your bastard kids, I work 12 hours a day, busting my ass to keep a roof over your heads, and this is the thanks I get?" Rebecca felt her heart hammering in her chest as she watched her mother's shoulders slump in defeat. This scene had played out dozens of times before. Vincent's anger, her mother's desperate attempts to keep peace, the growing hunger in her little sister's eyes. For months now, their meals had been whatever Vincent decided was good enough for them. Sometimes it was leftovers that had spoiled in the refrigerator for days. Sometimes it was food burnt beyond recognition because Vincent couldn't be bothered to watch the stove while he drank. And sometimes, on the worst days, it was nothing at all. "I'm sorry," Sarah murmured, returning to her laundry with hands that shook so badly she could barely fold the worn towels. "You're right. The girls need to learn to appreciate what they have." But Rebecca could see the pain in her mother's eyes, the way she gripped each piece of clothing as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. She knew her mama wanted to help them, wanted to protect them, but something held her back. Fear, maybe. Or the memory of the last time she'd stood up to Vincent and ended up with a bruised wrist she'd claimed came from falling down the stairs. Rebecca remembered that night 2 weeks ago when she'd gotten up for water and found her mother sitting at this same kitchen table, crying silently over a photograph of a man Rebecca had never met. When Sarah had noticed Rebecca watching, she'd quickly hidden the picture and pretended everything was fine. "Who was in the picture, Mama?" Rebecca had asked. "Your daddy," Sarah had whispered, pulling Rebecca onto her lap. "His name was Marcus, and he loved you very much before he went to heaven." "Why did he go to heaven?" Because sometimes good people have to leave before we're ready for them to go." Now, watching her mother's defeated posture as she folded Vincent's stained work shirts, Rebecca felt something burning in her chest. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was anger. Anger at Vincent for being so cruel. Anger at the situation that kept them trapped, and most of all, anger at her own helplessness. That night, after Vincent had retreated to his bedroom with his 6th beer, and her mother had tucked Madison and Chloe into the bed they all shared in the tiny back room, Rebecca lay awake, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere. Her stomach ached from hunger. They'd each managed only a few bites of the burnt rice before giving up, but her heart ached even more. She listened to her little sister's breathing, soft and innocent in sleep, and made a decision that would change everything. Madison whispered, "Becca," in her sleep, the way she sometimes did when her dreams were troubled. Rebecca reached over and stroked her sister's hair until her breathing evened out again. These 2 little girls depended on her to be strong, to be brave, to find solutions when the adults couldn't. Rebecca had learned to read when she was 4 years old, teaching herself with library books when Sarah was too exhausted to help. She understood far more than the adults realized about their situation, about why Vincent got angry, about why her mother stayed even though he made her cry. But understanding the problem and solving it were 2 different things. The next morning brought no relief. Vincent left for work in his usual cloud of cursing and cigarette smoke, slamming the door hard enough to wake Chloe, who immediately began crying. Sarah moved through her morning routine like a ghost, getting the girls dressed in clothes that were clean but patched, braiding their hair with gentle hands that trembled slightly. "Mama, tired?" Chloe observed, wrapping her small arms around Sarah's leg. "Mama's okay, baby," Sarah murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. Breakfast was more burnt oatmeal, the cheap instant kind that came in massive containers from the discount store. Vincent had specifically instructed Sarah to burn it slightly because he claimed it built character and taught the children not to be picky. Rebecca watched her mother serve the grey, lumpy mess, with tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Sarah had once told her about the breakfasts she used to make when Rebecca was very small. Fluffy pancakes with real syrup, scrambled eggs with cheese, fresh fruit cut into fun shapes. Those seemed like fairy tales now. While Vincent showered and her mother hung laundry in the basement laundromat, Rebecca crept into her parents' bedroom. The room was small and cluttered, dominated by an unmade bed and a dresser missing 2 drawer pulls. Vincent's work clothes were scattered on the floor, filling the air with the smell of concrete dust and tobacco. Her mother's old cell phone lay charging on the nightstand, its screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern from the time Vincent had accidentally knocked it out of Sarah's hands during an argument. The phone was ancient by modern standards, but it worked, and more importantly, it held contacts that Sarah had collected over the years. With trembling 7-year-old fingers, Rebecca unlocked the phone using the pattern she'd memorized from watching her mother. The lock screen wallpaper was a photo of Rebecca as a baby, chubby and smiling in the arms of a man with kind eyes and dark hair. Her father, Marcus. Rebecca scrolled through the contacts, most of them numbers for local businesses, old friends her mother rarely talked to anymore, or social services agencies that had never been much help. There were only about 20 numbers total, evidence of how isolated their lives had become, but then she saw it, a contact labeled simply Hope. The word seemed to glow on the cracked screen. Hope. Rebecca knew what that word meant from the stories her mother sometimes told her when the nights were especially dark and scary. Hope was what you held on to when everything else was gone. Hope was what kept you going when you wanted to give up. Something about that contact name made Rebecca's heart flutter with possibility. Whoever this person was, her mother had thought enough of them to name them Hope in her phone. Maybe this person could help them. Maybe this person cared about her mama. Rebecca's finger hovered over the call button. She could hear the shower still running, could hear her mother's footsteps in the basement. This might be her only chance. Before she could lose her courage, Rebecca pressed the button and held the phone to her ear with both hands. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure whoever answered would be able to hear it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Rebecca almost hung up when a deep professional voice answered. "This is David Thompson." The voice was nothing like what Rebecca had expected. It sounded important, authoritative, like the men in expensive suits she saw on television talking about serious business. But desperation gave her strength, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Daddy! Daddy, please, me and my sisters are having to eat burnt leftovers, and he makes us and Mamas too scared to stop him. And Madison cries every night, and Chloe is getting so skinny and I don't know what to do, and—" "Hold on, sweetheart," the voice interrupted, suddenly gentle in a way that made Rebecca's chest tight with unexpected emotion. "Slow down. Take a breath. Who is this, and who are you trying to reach?" Rebecca felt tears spilling down her cheeks, hot and fast. I don't know. Mama has your number saved as Hope, and she told us our daddy died in an accident, but maybe she was wrong. Maybe you're alive somewhere and you can help us. We really need help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Rebecca could hear the sound of a chair creaking, papers rustling, and then footsteps pacing across what sounded like a very large room with hard floors. "What's your name, honey?" the man asked, his voice now filled with an emotion Rebecca couldn't identify, but that made her feel safer somehow. Rebecca Martinez. I'm 7 years old, and I live on Maple Street with Mama and my little sisters Madison and Chloe and Vincent, who isn't very nice to us and makes us eat yucky food and makes Mama cry. Another pause, longer this time. When the man spoke again, his voice was tight with something that sounded like barely controlled anger. "Rebecca, I need you to tell me exactly what's happening at your house. Can you do that for me? Can you be very brave and tell me the truth?" And so, standing in her mother's bedroom, with her father's photo watching from the nightstand, 7-year-old Rebecca began to tell a complete stranger about their life. She told him about the burnt food that made their stomachs hurt. She told him about Vincent's angry words that made her mother flinch. She told him about the bruises her mother tried to hide with long sleeves even in summer. She told him about lying awake at night, listening to Madison's hungry whimpering and Chloe's restless tossing. She told him about watching her mother cry when she thought no one was looking. She told him about feeling scared all the time and not knowing what to do about it. "And Mama says our real daddy died in a car accident," Rebecca finished, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "But I thought maybe you might know him. Or maybe you could help us anyway, even though we're not your family." The silence stretched so long that Rebecca thought the call had been disconnected. But then the man spoke, and his voice was thick with emotion that made Rebecca's heart pound with something that might have been hope. "Rebecca," he said slowly, "I think there's a chance I might be your daddy's brother. What was your father's name?" "Marcus," Rebecca whispered. "Marcus Martinez." "Oh my God," the man breathed, and Rebecca heard what sounded like something heavy falling to the floor. "Rebecca, sweetheart, I need you to listen very carefully. Is your mama there right now?" "She's in the basement doing laundry." "Good. I want you to go get her and bring her to the phone." "Can you do that?" "Should I tell her I called you?" "Yes, honey. Tell her that David Thompson wants to talk to her. Tell her it's about Marcus." Rebecca's heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. "David Thompson, are you really my daddy's brother?" "I think I might be, sweetheart. And if I am, then you girls are my family, and family takes care of each other." Rebecca ran down the narrow stairs to the basement, where her mother was hanging Vincent's work shirts on a makeshift clothesline strung between water pipes. The basement smelled of mildew and detergent, and the single bare bulb cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls. "Mama!" Rebecca called out, breathless with excitement and fear. "Mama! Come quick! There's a man on the phone who says he might be Daddy's brother." Sarah dropped the wet shirt she'd been holding, and it landed with a splat on the concrete floor. "Rebecca, what are you talking about? What phone call?" "I called the number in your phone that says Hope," Rebecca said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I told him about Vincent and the burnt food, and he says his name is David Thompson, and he wants to talk to you about Daddy." The colour drained from Sarah's face so quickly that Rebecca thought she might faint. Sarah gripped the edge of the laundry table, her knuckles turning white. "You called? Rebecca, oh honey, what did you do?" I asked for help," Rebecca said simply, "like you always tell us to do when we're in trouble." Sarah stared at her oldest daughter, this brave little girl who had somehow found the courage to do what Sarah herself had been too afraid to attempt. Then she was moving, taking the stairs two at a time, with Rebecca close behind. The phone was still connected when they reached the bedroom, lying on the bed where Rebecca had carefully placed it. "Hello?" Sarah said tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Martinez?" "Yes. This is David Thompson, I think. I think you knew my brother Marcus." The phone slipped from Sarah's fingers. Rebecca caught it before it could hit the floor and held it up so her mother could hear. "But you're supposed to be," Sarah started, then stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "Dead?" David finished. "Yes, I imagine that's what you were told." "Sarah, we need to meet. Today, I'm coming to you." "No," Sarah said quickly. "Vincent will be back soon, and if he finds you here—" "Sarah," David's voice was gentle but firm, "I'm a very wealthy man with resources you can't imagine. Vincent doesn't scare me. What scares me is that my brother's daughter just called me because she's being starved." "Your brother's?" Sarah sank onto the bed, pulling Rebecca into her arms. "How do you know Rebecca's Marcus's daughter?" "Because she has his eyes, because she has his courage, and because 8 years ago my twin brother Marcus told me he was moving to Portland for work, and I never heard from him again." Sarah began crying then, deep sobs that seemed to come from some broken place inside her. Rebecca had seen her mother cry before, but never like this. These weren't the quiet, defeated tears that came after Vincent's rages. These were tears of grief and hope, and 8 years of buried pain finally finding their way to the surface. "Mama," Rebecca said softly, stroking her mother's hair, the way Sarah always did when Rebecca was scared. "Is Uncle David really Daddy's brother?" I think he might be, baby." "Then why did you think he was dead?" Sarah looked down at Rebecca, this wise little girl who deserved so much more than the life they'd been giving her. "Because Daddy showed me a newspaper article that said his brother had died fighting in a war. But maybe Daddy was wrong about some things." David's voice came through the phone speaker, patient and kind. "Sarah, I'm going to come to your house now. I'm going to bring lunch for you and the girls, real food, good food. Then we're going to figure out what happened to Marcus and why you thought I was dead." "David, you don't understand," Sarah said urgently. "Vincent isn't just mean. He's dangerous when he's angry. If he comes home and finds you here, then we'll deal with Vincent together," David said calmly. "Sarah, I've spent 8 years not knowing I had family. I'm not going to spend another 8 hours letting my nieces go hungry because someone's afraid of a bully." Rebecca tugged on her mother's dress. "Mama, is Uncle David coming to save us?" Sarah looked down into those blue eyes that were so much like Marcus's, eyes that held the same determination and strength that had first made her fall in love with Rebecca's father. "I think he might be, baby," Sarah whispered. "I think he just might be." 20 minutes later, Rebecca stood pressed against the living room window with Madison and Chloe, watching for any sign of their uncle's arrival. The street outside was quiet in the way that only weekday afternoons in working-class neighborhoods could be. Most of the adults were at jobs, most of the older kids were at school, leaving only a few toddlers playing in small front yards under their mothers' watchful eyes. The houses on Maple Street were nearly identical, small 2-story structures built in the 1950s when the neighborhood had been full of young families with bright dreams. Now many of the houses showed signs of deferred maintenance and economic struggle. Peeling paint, patched roofs, yards where grass fought a losing battle against weeds. "What does a CEO car look like?" Madison asked, pressing her nose against the glass. "Probably big and shiny," Rebecca said, though she wasn't entirely sure what a CEO was. She'd heard the word on television sometimes, usually associated with men in expensive suits who lived in tall buildings. "There," Chloe pointed excitedly down the street. "Shiny car." A sleek black sedan was turning onto Maple Street, moving slowly, as if the driver was checking house numbers. The car was indeed big and shiny, so clean it seemed to glow against the backdrop of the modest neighborhood. Rebecca's heart began racing again. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Uncle David." The car pulled up in front of their house and stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's side door opened, and Rebecca got her first look at the man whose voice had given her the first hope she'd felt in months. David Thompson stepped out of the car and immediately commanded attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Vincent made in a month. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and even from a distance, Rebecca could see that he moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. But what struck Rebecca most was his face. It was like looking at a photograph of her father, if her father had lived to be older and more successful. The same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same way of holding his head when he was thinking seriously about something. "Madison, Chloe, come away from the window," Sarah called nervously from the kitchen. "Girls, I need you to be very good right now, okay? This man he's special to our family." Rebecca didn't move from the window. She watched as David looked up at their house, taking in the peeling paint and cracked front step with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was he disappointed? Sad? Angry? Then David looked directly at the window where she was standing, and their eyes met through the glass. His face transformed instantly, softening with an emotion that made Rebecca's chest feel warm and tight. He smiled and waved at her, and Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. She felt safe. David Thompson stood in his corner office on the 40th floor of Thompson Tower, staring out at the Chicago skyline without really seeing it. The phone call from the little girl had ended 20 minutes ago, but her words still echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. Sarah Martinez. The name had hit him like a lightning bolt to the chest, bringing back memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Sweet, beautiful Sarah with the infectious laugh and emerald eyes who had disappeared from his life 8 years ago without a word of explanation. "Mr. Thompson." His assistant Miranda knocked on the office door. "Your 11 o'clock is here." "Cancel it," David said without turning around. "Cancel everything for today." Miranda's eyebrows rose in surprise. In the 5 years she'd worked for David, he'd never cancelled an entire day of meetings. "Sir, the Bradley Industries merger. We'll have to wait." David finally turned from the window, and Miranda took a step back at the intensity in his dark brown eyes. "I need you to run some addresses for me." Quietly. 20 minutes later, David sat in the back of his black Mercedes as his driver navigated through the narrow streets of Sarah's neighborhood. The contrast between his usual world and this one was stark. Where his penthouse overlooked the glittering lake, these row houses pressed close together with tiny front yards and chain-link fences. His phone buzzed with messages from his board of directors, wondering where he was, but David ignored them all. For once in his carefully controlled life, business could wait. The house at 1247 Maple Street looked even smaller in person than he'd imagined from Rebecca's description. Paint peeled from the white siding, and one of the front steps was cracked down the middle. But what caught his attention were the 3 small faces pressed against the living room window, 2 little girls with dark curls and 1 slightly older child with lighter hair who must be Rebecca. David's heart clenched as he recognized something familiar in Rebecca's features, something that reminded him of old family photographs he kept locked away in his private safe. He was about to get out of the car when the front door burst open and a man emerged. Vincent, David assumed. He was shorter than David had pictured, with graying hair and a beer belly straining against a stained t-shirt. But there was something in his posture, in the way he looked around suspiciously, that set David's teeth on edge. Vincent climbed into a rusty pickup truck and drove away, probably heading to whatever construction job kept food on their table. Once he was gone, David waited another 10 minutes before approaching the house. His knock was answered by a woman who took his breath away. Sarah stood in the doorway looking exactly as beautiful as he remembered, though stress had added lines around her eyes and her cheeks were thinner than they'd been 8 years ago. She wore a faded blue dress that had seen better days, but her natural grace made her look elegant despite everything. "Hello, Sarah," David said softly. The color drained from her face. The plate she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the doorstep, sending pieces of ceramic scattering across the concrete. "David," she whispered, gripping the doorframe for support. "But you're supposed to be dead?" David finished. "Yes, I imagine that's what you were told." Behind Sarah, 3 small faces peered around her legs. Rebecca's eyes widened as she recognized the voice from the phone call, while Madison and Chloe hung back shyly. "Mama," Rebecca asked in a small voice, "is this the man I called?" Sarah's green eyes darted between David and her daughter, confusion and something that looked like hope warring across her features. I don't understand. Rebecca, what man? What did you do?" "I called the number in your phone," Rebecca said, stepping forward with the courage that had driven her to make that first call. "The one that says hope." I told him about the burnt food and about Vincent and, oh God. Sarah's legs seemed to give out, and she sank onto the front steps, burying her face in her hands. Rebecca, no, you don't understand. You can't. He's not. David knelt down until he was eye level with Sarah, his expensive suit jacket spread across the dirty concrete. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, but filled with an authority that made even the children stop talking. Sarah, we need to talk. But first, when was the last time these girls had a proper meal? Sarah looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks. David, I can explain everything, but you have to understand. The meal, Sarah. When? Yesterday morning, she admitted in a broken whisper. Vincent, he says we spend too much on groceries. The girls had burnt oatmeal yesterday and burnt rice today, and before that. David stood up, pulling his phone from his jacket pocket. Miranda, I need you to order lunch for 5 people, children's meals, from that family restaurant on 5th Street, you know, the one with the good mac and cheese. Deliver it to 1247 Maple Street immediately. But sir, now, Miranda. He ended the call and looked down at Sarah, who was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. We're going to feed your daughters first. Then you're going to tell me exactly why you thought I was dead, and why my brother's children are living in poverty while I've been building an empire. Your brother. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. My twin brother Marcus, the one who died in a car accident 8 years ago. David's jaw tightened. The one who told me he was moving to Portland for work, but apparently never made it out of Chicago. Sarah's face went completely white, and for a moment David thought she might faint. Rebecca, who had been listening to every word with wide, intelligent eyes, suddenly stepped forward and took David's large hand in her small one. Are you really my daddy's brother? She asked, with the directness that only children possess. David looked down into eyes that were startlingly familiar, the same unusual shade of dark blue that he saw in the mirror every morning, the same eyes that had belonged to his twin brother Marcus. Yes, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. I think I am. But as David spoke those words, he had no idea that the truth about Rebecca's parentage was far more complex than anyone could imagine, and that the real shock was still to come. The lunch arrived 30 minutes later, carried by a delivery driver who looked confused to be bringing gourmet children's meals to this particular neighborhood. David watched as Rebecca, Madison, and Chloe devoured mac and cheese, grilled chicken strips, and fresh fruit, with an enthusiasm that broke his heart into pieces. Slow down, babies, Sarah murmured, but she was crying again as she watched her daughters eat real food for the first time in days. Each bite they took seemed to restore color to their pale cheeks, energy to their tired little bodies. David sat at the small kitchen table, his 6-foot frame making the cheap furniture look miniature. He'd removed his jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, trying to look less intimidating to the children. But his mind was racing with questions that demanded answers, connections that didn't quite fit together yet. The kitchen was warmer now, filled with the sound of children's laughter instead of the oppressive silence that had greeted him earlier. Madison was carefully arranging her apple slices in a perfect circle on her plate, while Chloe attempted to feed her stuffed bunny imaginary bites of chicken. Rebecca ate more slowly, but with obvious pleasure, savoring each flavor like it was a gift. This is the best food ever, Madison announced seriously, licking mac and cheese from her fork with the dedication of a food critic. Better than burnt rice? David asked with a smile. So much better, Chloe agreed, her speech slightly garbled by the food in her mouth. Sarah watched her daughters with tears streaming down her cheeks. David pulled a pristine handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. I'm sorry, she whispered, dabbing at her eyes. It's been so long since I've seen them this happy, since they've had enough to eat. How long, Sarah? David asked quietly, his voice controlled but his eyes blazing with protective anger. 6 months, she admitted. Maybe longer. Vincent lost his steady construction job in the spring, and since then we've been living on whatever day labor he can find. He says feeding the girls properly is spoiling them. David made a mental note to ensure Vincent never worked construction in Chicago again. A few phone calls to the right people would accomplish that easily. "Sarah," he said carefully while the girls were distracted by their meal, "I need you to explain something to me. 8 years ago, Marcus told me he was taking a job in Portland. Construction management, he said. Good money, fresh start." Sarah's hands trembled as she wiped Madison's face with a paper towel. He did get offered the job, but he never made it to Portland. The accident? Highway 94, just outside the city limits. Her voice was barely audible. Police said he fell asleep at the wheel around 2 a.m. Hit a semi-truck head-on, they said. They said he died instantly. David felt the familiar pain lance through his chest. He and Marcus had been identical twins, but they'd chosen completely different paths in life. While David had built a business empire through calculated risks and careful planning, Marcus had preferred working with his hands, building things, creating something tangible that would last. They'd grown apart over the years, especially after their parents died in a house fire when the twins were 25. David had thrown himself into work to deal with the grief, while Marcus had traveled, taking construction jobs in different cities, never staying anywhere too long. "But Sarah," David said carefully, "if Marcus died 8 years ago, and Rebecca is 7. He let the math hang in the air between them. Sarah's green eyes met his, and in them he saw a pain so deep it made him want to gather her in his arms and promise that everything would be okay. "Rebecca was born 8 months and 2 weeks after the accident," she whispered. "I didn't even know I was pregnant until 2 weeks after Marcus's funeral. By then he was gone and I was completely alone." David's world tilted on its axis. "That means Rebecca is Marcus's daughter. He never knew about her, never knew he was going to be a father." Rebecca looked up from her chicken strips, her sharp ears catching her name in the adult conversation. "Mama, are you talking about Daddy?" Sarah reached over and stroked her daughter's hair with infinite gentleness. "Yes, baby. I'm telling Uncle David about your daddy." "Was Daddy really Uncle David's twin?" Rebecca asked, her blue eyes moving between the two adults with keen intelligence. "Yes, sweetheart," David said, his throat tight with emotion. "Your daddy Marcus was my identical twin brother. We looked exactly alike." Madison, who had been quietly eating her fruit, suddenly spoke up. "What's an identical twin?" "It means they were born at the same time and looked exactly the same," Rebecca explained with the confident authority of an older sister, "like 2 copies of the same person." "That's exactly right," David said, impressed by her understanding. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photos until he found one from their college graduation. 2 young men with identical faces grinning at the camera in caps and gowns. The 3 girls crowded around the phone, their eyes wide with wonder. "You really do look the same," Madison exclaimed, studying the photo intently. "Daddy's smile is bigger," Rebecca observed with the detailed attention that only children possessed. "He always was the happier one," David agreed, feeling warmth spread through his chest despite the circumstances. Marcus found joy in simple things, building something with his hands, making people laugh, playing with children. "Did he like to read stories?" Rebecca asked hopefully. "He loved stories. Used to make them up for me when we were kids." David looked at this little girl who was his brother's legacy, this brave child who had reached out across years of separation and silence to bring their family back together. But as touching as this family reunion was, David knew they needed to address the serious issues that Rebecca's phone call had revealed. The burnt food, the fear in Sarah's eyes, the way all 3 girls instinctively tensed when they heard heavy footsteps. "Sarah," he said gently, "we need to talk about what's been happening here." What Rebecca told me about Vincent's treatment of you and the girls." Sarah's face crumpled, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold the pieces together. "David, I know how it sounds, but it's so complicated. After Marcus died, I was pregnant with no money, no family support, no way to take care of myself, let alone a baby." She gestured toward Madison and Chloe, who were now sharing bites of each other's food with the easy generosity of children. "Vincent and we met at the hospital when Rebecca was born. He was there because his girlfriend was having complications with her own pregnancy. We started talking, and he seemed kind, supportive." David was beginning to understand the fuller picture. "Madison and Chloe are Vincent's daughters." "From different relationships," Sarah admitted quietly. "His first girlfriend left Madison with him when she was 6 months old. Then his second girlfriend died in childbirth with Chloe. Vincent had 2 little girls and no idea how to care for them. I had Rebecca and no way to support her." "So you decided to help each other." "It seemed like the answer to both our problems," Sarah said, fresh tears starting down her cheeks. "Vincent had a steady job and a house. I had experience with children and no place to go. For the first year, it actually worked. We were like a family." "What changed?" Sarah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Vincent started drinking more after he lost his steady job. The stress of supporting 4 people on day labor wages made him angry all the time. He began blaming me for our financial problems, saying I ate too much, the girls were too expensive, that we were dragging him down." "He's mean to Mama," Madison said matter-of-factly, apparently more perceptive than the adults had realized. "Madison, shh," Sarah said quickly, glancing nervously at the front door as if Vincent might burst through it at any moment. But David leaned forward, giving Madison his full attention with the same seriousness he brought to board meetings. "What do you mean, he's mean to Mama, sweetheart?" Madison's 4-year-old vocabulary struggled to express what she'd observed, but she tried earnestly. "He says loud words that make Mama's eyes leaky, and sometimes he squeezes her arm too tight and it makes purple marks." David's hands clenched into fists on the table, but he kept his voice calm and gentle. "Purple marks like bruises?" "Madison, please don't," Sarah begged. "David, you don't understand the full situation." "Then help me understand," David said, his CEO authority creeping into his voice despite his efforts to stay gentle. "Help me understand how the mother of my brother's child ended up trapped in an abusive situation with a man who starves children." Sarah took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. "After Marcus died, I lost our apartment. The lease was in his name, and I couldn't afford it on my own. I was 8 months pregnant, couldn't work, had no savings. Vincent seemed like salvation, a good man with a steady job who promised to take care of all of us. And now? Now I have 3 children and no marketable skills," Sarah said, the words coming out in a rush. "I never finished high school because I got pregnant with Rebecca. I have no work experience except cleaning houses under the table. Vincent may not be perfect, but he keeps a roof over our heads and food on the table." "Burnt food," Rebecca interjected quietly but firmly. Sarah winced. "It's better than no food at all." David studied Sarah's face, seeing the intelligence and strength that poverty and fear had nearly crushed, but not quite destroyed. This was the woman his brother had fallen in love with, the mother who had raised Rebecca with enough courage to reach out for help when help was needed most. "Sarah, what would you do if Vincent wasn't in the picture? If you and the girls were completely free to make your own choices?" Sarah faltered, the question clearly one she'd stopped allowing herself to consider. "I don't know. I haven't let myself think about that in years." Rebecca had been listening intently to every word, her 7-year-old mind processing information with startling maturity. Now she set down her fork and looked directly at David with those blue eyes that were so much like Marcus's. "Uncle David," she said with the serious tone of a child forced to grow up too fast. Are you rich like the people on TV who live in big houses? David couldn't help but smile at her directness. Children had a way of cutting through adult complications to reach the heart of matters. Yes, sweetheart, I am. Rich enough to help Mama take care of us without Vincent? The question hung in the air like a challenge. David looked around the kitchen, taking in the peeling linoleum, the dented refrigerator held closed with duct tape, the 3 beautiful children who shared his brother's blood, and the woman who had somehow kept them all together, despite impossible circumstances. Rebecca, he said solemnly, meeting her gaze with the same respect he'd give to any important business partner. I'm rich enough to change everything. The question is, do you trust me to do that? Rebecca studied his face for a long moment. This man who looked like her father, but was a stranger. This uncle who had appeared like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. Yes, she said finally, with the absolute conviction that only children possess. I trust you. And with those 3 words, everything shifted. David felt responsibility settle on his shoulders like a mantle, not the cold weight of corporate obligation, but the warm, fierce protectiveness that comes with family. But as David looked into Sarah's hopeful eyes and made silent promises about the future, he had no idea that Vincent was already on his way home early from work, having heard from a neighbor about the expensive black car parked outside his house. And none of them knew that 8 years of lies and manipulation were about to come crashing down around them in ways that would test every bond they were beginning to form. The real revelations about this family were just beginning to unfold, and they would prove more shocking than anyone in that kitchen could possibly imagine. The sound of Vincent's pickup truck rumbling into the driveway made everyone in the kitchen freeze. Sarah's face went pale as paper, and she instinctively moved closer to her daughters. He's early, she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. David, you need to leave. If he sees you here... I'm not going anywhere, David said firmly, standing up to his full height. At 6'2", with the confidence that came from commanding boardrooms full of powerful men, he was an imposing figure even in the humble kitchen. The front door slammed open with such force it rattled the windows. Vincent's heavy footsteps echoed through the small house as he made his way toward the kitchen, muttering curses under his breath. Sarah! Who the hell parked that fancy car outside my house? You better not be... Vincent's words died in his throat as he entered the kitchen and saw David standing there in his expensive suit. For a moment, the 2 men simply stared at each other. Vincent was stockier and had the calloused hands of someone who worked construction, but David had the unmistakable presence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Who are you? Vincent demanded, his face already flushing red with anger. And what are you doing in my house? I'm David Thompson, David said calmly, not moving from his protective position near the children, and I'm here about how you've been treating my family. Vincent's eyes narrowed dangerously. Family? Sarah, what kind of game are you playing? You said Rebecca's father was some dead construction worker with no relatives. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sarah told you Marcus had no family. Course she did, Vincent snarled. Said that's why she needed my help so bad when my own daughters Madison and Chloe were born. No family, no money, nowhere else to go with 3 kids. David suddenly understood more of the picture. Vincent was the biological father of the 2 younger girls, which explained why he'd been willing to take in Sarah and Rebecca initially, but it didn't excuse how he'd been treating them all. Sarah, David said gently, why would you tell him Marcus had no family? I thought it was true, she whispered. It was... Marcus said his brother had died in Afghanistan. Military service. He showed me your obituary from the Chicago Tribune. David felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Sarah, I was never in the military. I've been running Thompson Industries for 12 years. That's impossible, Sarah said, shaking her head. Marcus showed me proof. The funeral. Everything. Vincent, who had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion and rage, suddenly exploded. I don't give a damn about your soap opera drama. This is my house, and I want this rich boy out of it right now. He took a threatening step toward David, but David didn't move an inch. Vincent, David said in a voice that could freeze steel, I suggest you very carefully consider your next words and actions. Or what? You'll call your daddy's lawyers? David pulled out his phone and speed-dialed a number. It was answered on the first ring. Detective Morrison, this is David Thompson. I need you to come to 1247 Maple Street immediately. I have 3 children who've been subjected to neglect and emotional abuse. Yes, I'll wait for you. Vincent's face went from red to white. You can't. I never laid a hand on those kids. But you've been starving them, David said quietly. Feeding them inedible food, terrorizing their mother, creating an environment of fear and psychological abuse. Mama, Rebecca said suddenly, tugging on Sarah's dress. What's an obituary? Sarah knelt down and gathered Rebecca into her arms. It's what they put in the newspaper when someone dies, baby. But Uncle David isn't dead, Madison observed with 4-year-old logic. No, Sarah said slowly, looking up at David with dawning realization. He's not. David was putting pieces together too, and what he was discovering made his blood run cold. Sarah, do you still have that obituary, the one Marcus showed you? Sarah nodded and disappeared into the bedroom, returning moments later with a newspaper clipping that had been folded and refolded so many times it was falling apart. She handed it to David with trembling fingers. David stared at the yellowed paper, reading his own fake obituary. The photo was definitely him, or Marcus, since they were identical, but the details were all wrong. Wrong unit, wrong dates, wrong circumstances entirely. Sarah, he said slowly, this obituary is completely fabricated. Vincent, who had been growing increasingly agitated, suddenly lunged for the door. I don't have to listen to this insane shit. Sarah, when you come to your senses, you'll remember who's been supporting Madison and Chloe all these years. By making them eat garbage, Rebecca said clearly, making Vincent stop in his tracks. What did you say, you little brat? David stepped between Vincent and Rebecca so fast, Vincent barely saw him move. I think you should leave now. This is my house. Those are my daughters. Actually, David said, pulling another phone from his pocket, Miranda, I need you to contact our real estate division. I want to know who owns the property at 1247 Maple Street. I see. And the landlord is behind on the mortgage. Perfect. Buy it. Buy it immediately. Vincent's mouth fell open as David ended the call. As of about 5 minutes from now, David said calmly, this will be my house, which means you're trespassing. The sound of police sirens in the distance made Vincent's face go ashen. He looked around the kitchen like a trapped animal, then grabbed his keys from the counter. You think you're so clever, he spat at David, but you don't know anything about what's really happening here. Your brother found out things that got him killed, and if you keep digging, you'll end up just like him. He stormed out, leaving behind only the smell of stale beer and a house full of people trying to process what he'd just revealed. Detective Morrison arrived 20 minutes later to find David helping Chloe color in a coloring book, while Sarah explained the situation in quiet, measured tones. The detective took notes, asked gentle questions about Vincent's treatment of the children, and assured Sarah that appropriate protective measures would be implemented. The restraining order will be processed by morning, Detective Morrison explained. And given what you've described about the children's living conditions, social services will need to document everything. But Mr. Thompson's involvement should ensure the process goes smoothly. After the detective left, David sat with Sarah while the girls played quietly in the living room. The weight of Vincent's parting words hung heavy between them. "Sarah," David said finally, "what did Vincent mean when he said Marcus found out things that got him killed?" Sarah's green eyes filled with fear. "Marcus came to see me the night before he was supposed to leave for Portland. He was different that night, agitated, scared. He kept saying he'd discovered something terrible about his work, something that involved you." "What kind of something?" "He wouldn't tell me exactly, but he said someone had been using Thompson Industries to hurt people. Families had been displaced, children had gotten sick from contaminated water, also someone could make money." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said the worst part was that it was all being done in your name, but you didn't know about it." David felt ice form in his veins. He thought I was being manipulated. He said someone close to you was making you sign things without understanding what they really meant. Marcus had proof, documents that showed the real story. Sarah gripped David's hand tightly. "He was trying to protect you by taking that evidence to the authorities. And then he died in a convenient car accident," David said grimly. "David," Sarah said, meeting his eyes, "what if it wasn't an accident at all?" David's private office felt like a war room the next morning as he spread documents across his mahogany desk. He'd spent the night in the hotel suite with Sarah and the girls, but sleep had been impossible. Every detail of Marcus's supposed death now looked suspicious under careful examination. His head of security, James Crawford, entered carrying a thick file and wearing the grim expression of a man bearing terrible news. "What did you find, James?" David asked, though something in his gut already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. "I contacted the FBI agent who was supposed to meet with Marcus, Patricia Ross. She's been investigating Thompson Industries for corporate fraud for 12 years. James spread photographs across the desk. "Your brother wasn't the criminal, sir. He was trying to expose the real criminals." The first photograph showed Marcus entering the FBI building 3 days before his death. His face was drawn with worry, but his posture was determined. Agent Ross says Marcus brought her evidence that someone inside Thompson Industries had been forging your signature on illegal contracts for over a decade, James continued. The Riverside Development Project was just the tip of the iceberg. David picked up the next photograph, a document with his signature on it, authorizing bribes to city officials for environmental permits. But as he studied it closely, he realized something chilling. "This isn't my signature," he said slowly. "It's close, but the D is different, the way the T connects to the H in Thompson." "Marcus brought Agent Ross 12 years of forged documents," James confirmed. "Someone had been systematically using your identity to commit fraud while keeping you completely in the dark." "But who? Who had that kind of access to my personal information, my schedule, my—" David stopped mid-sentence as realization hit him like a freight train. "Sir?" "Miranda," David whispered. "My assistant Miranda. She's had access to everything for 5 years. She knows my signature better than anyone. She schedules my meetings, handles my documents." James nodded grimly. "We ran a deeper background check on Miranda Williams after you called yesterday. Sir, Miranda Williams doesn't exist. The identity was created 5 years ago." David's hands clenched into fists. "Who is she really?" "Her real name is Miranda Thompson. She's the daughter of the last legitimate heir to the Thompson fortune, the fortune that built Thompson Industries." The room seemed to spin around David. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that everything you've believed about your life is a lie." James pulled out a final set of documents. "David, you were never supposed to inherit Thompson Industries. The real heir was a boy named Michael Thompson who died in childhood. Someone arranged for you to be placed with a family, groomed you for years, and then positioned you to take over the company when old man Thompson died." David sank into his chair, feeling like his entire identity was crumbling. "I was a replacement heir? Miranda's been playing a 12-year game. First, she had you unknowingly sign documents that made Thompson Industries incredibly profitable through illegal means. Then she worked as your assistant to control every aspect of your business decisions. The plan was to eventually expose the fraud, destroy you, and claim the company as the rightful Thompson heir. But Marcus figured it out. Marcus was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He may have worked construction, but he had a sharp mind for details. When he noticed inconsistencies in Thompson Industries contracts on job sites, he started investigating. David's phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Stop digging or Sarah Martinez and her daughters disappear forever. You have 24 hours to transfer $50 million to account 847392615 and leave Chicago permanently. James immediately began tracing the call while David stared at the message. She's been watching us. Sir, there's something else. James hesitated. Miranda has had surveillance on Sarah for 8 years. She's the one who arranged for Vincent to meet Sarah. She needed Sarah isolated and dependent so she could never investigate Marcus's death or reach out to you. The full scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its cruelty. Miranda had murdered Marcus to stop his investigation, then spent years keeping his girlfriend trapped in poverty while manipulating David like a puppet. And if I'd never found Sarah, Miranda would have eventually framed you for all the fraud and claimed Thompson Industries as the wronged legitimate heir. With Marcus dead and Sarah silent, there would be no one left to contradict her story. David's phone rang. This time he recognized the number. It was Sarah calling from the hotel. David, Sarah's voice was tight with fear. Someone's been in our room. They left another package. What kind of package? Photographs. Of the girls playing in the hotel lobby this morning, and a note that says they look so innocent. It would be a shame if something happened to them. David was already moving toward the door. Sarah, take the girls into the bathroom and lock the door. Don't come out until you hear my voice. David, what's happening? I'll explain everything when I get there, but Sarah, Miranda Williams, my assistant, if she shows up at that hotel for any reason, you run. Do you understand me? You take those girls and you run. I understand. As David raced through Chicago traffic toward the hotel, James was already coordinating with the FBI and updating building security. But they were all about to discover that Miranda had been planning her final move for months. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone escape. David burst through the hotel suite door to find Sarah and the 3 girls huddled together on the couch, surrounded by his security team. Agent Ross was examining photographs spread across the coffee table, images of the girls taken that morning without anyone noticing. Mr. Thompson, Agent Ross said grimly, we need to talk. Is my family safe? For now. But Miranda Thompson has disappeared. We raided her apartment an hour ago and found 12 years of surveillance equipment, forged documents, and detailed plans for what she calls Operation Restoration. David knelt down in front of Rebecca, Madison, and Chloe, who were watching him with worried expressions. Are you girls okay? Did anyone scary come to visit you? The nice hotel lady brought us cookies, Madison said seriously, but Mama made us throw them away. Smart Mama, David said, looking gratefully at Sarah. Rebecca studied his face with those perceptive blue eyes. Uncle David, are we in danger? David could have lied to protect her innocence, but this little girl had already proven she was stronger than most adults. There's a bad person who wants to hurt our family, sweetheart. But I promise you, I won't let that happen. Agent Ross pulled David aside. Mr. Thompson, we found something else in Miranda's apartment. Documents that explain everything. She handed him a folder marked Thompson Twins, Project Genesis. Inside were medical records, adoption papers, and a detailed family tree that made David's head spin. David, Agent Ross said carefully, You and Marcus weren't stolen babies. You were placed deliberately. What do you mean? The original Thompson family had a genetic disorder that killed most children before age 10. When the last legitimate heir died, the family trustees needed someone to inherit the company to prevent it from dissolving. They found identical twin boys in the foster system and placed you with different families. David stared at the documents. They were creating backup heirs. You were raised to be the public face of Thompson Industries. Marcus was supposed to be the backup if something happened to you. But Miranda Thompson, she was the illegitimate daughter of the last real Thompson heir. She's been plotting to reclaim what she believes is rightfully hers since she was 15 years old. How? First, she got close to you through an internship program, eventually becoming your assistant. Then she began forging your signature on increasingly illegal contracts. The plan was to make Thompson Industries incredibly profitable through criminal means, then expose you as the mastermind and claim the company as the wronged legitimate heir. David felt sick. But Marcus discovered what she was doing. Your brother was working on a riverside development construction site 12 years ago when he noticed that environmental permits were backdated and signatures looked suspicious. He started investigating on his own time, following paper trails, asking questions, and he realized I was being set up. Exactly. Marcus contacted the FBI not to expose you, but to protect you. He'd gathered evidence that you were being manipulated and that all the illegal activity was happening without your knowledge. Sarah, who had been listening from the couch while keeping the girls distracted, suddenly gasped. That's why he was so scared that last night. He wasn't leaving to start over. He was going into witness protection. The FBI had offered Marcus protection in exchange for his testimony, Agent Ross confirmed, but someone tipped off Miranda about the meeting. David's phone buzzed. Text message. Pier 19, Warehouse 7. Come alone or the children die tonight. And she has Vincent, David realized. And she's using him as bait, Agent Ross said. Mr. Thompson, this is obviously a trap. David looked at Rebecca, who was helping Chloe build a tower out of blocks. This brave little girl had made one desperate phone call and uncovered a conspiracy that reached back to before she was born. He thought about Marcus, who had died trying to protect him from a truth he never knew existed. Agent Ross, David said quietly. What's the plan? 2 hours later, David walked alone into the dimly lit warehouse on Pier 19. His earpiece crackled with the voices of FBI agents positioned around the building, but he felt completely isolated as he stepped into the shadows. Hello, David. Miranda emerged from behind a stack of shipping containers, but she looked nothing like the professional assistant he'd known for 5 years. Her blonde hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her business attire had been replaced by dark clothes that made her look dangerous. Hello, Miranda. Or should I say, Miranda Thompson? She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You finally figured it out. I wondered how long it would take. Long enough for you to destroy my brother's life and terrorize his family. Your brother was collateral damage, she said coldly, just like you were supposed to be. David could see Vincent tied up in a chair about 20 feet away. The man was conscious but gagged, his eyes wide with fear. What do you want, Miranda? I want my birthright. Thompson Industries was built with my family's money, expanded with my family's connections, grown into an empire that should have been mine by right. Her voice grew more venomous with each word. Instead, the trustees gave it to some random orphan they picked out of foster care. Random orphan who built the company into something bigger than it ever was. Using illegal contracts I arranged, Miranda's composure cracked. Every major deal for the past 5 years, every expansion, every acquisition, I made it happen by forging your signature on bribes and illegal agreements. You're nothing but a puppet who got credit for my work. David took a careful step closer. "And you killed Marcus because he was going to expose your scheme. Marcus was going to ruin everything. Years of planning, years of positioning myself, all destroyed because some construction worker got curious about paperwork. That construction worker was trying to protect me. That construction worker cost me 8 years." Miranda pulled a gun from her jacket. "I should have killed you instead of him, would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." David heard Agent Ross's voice in his earpiece. "We have a clear shot. Say the word." But David was thinking about Rebecca's question from that morning. "Uncle David, when bad people try to hurt good people, what should the good people do?" He'd told her that good people tried to help bad people become good again, if possible. "Miranda," David said softly, "it doesn't have to end this way. Thompson Industries can support both of us. There's enough wealth there for everyone." For a moment, something flickered in Miranda's eyes. Something that might have been the lost little girl who'd grown up knowing she'd been cheated out of her inheritance. But then her face hardened again. "Too late for that, David. Way too late." The warehouse suddenly flooded with light as FBI agents burst through every entrance. Miranda spun around in confusion, her gun wavering between David and Vincent. "Drop your weapon!" Agent Ross shouted. In the chaos that followed, David dove for Vincent's chair, while Miranda fired wildly at the FBI agents. The sound of gunshots echoed off the warehouse walls. But when the shooting stopped, it was Miranda on the ground, wounded but alive, and Vincent and David both unharmed. 3 days later, David sat in the same kitchen where this had all began. But everything was different now. The house had been completely renovated. New appliances, fresh paint, beautiful furniture that somehow still felt like home rather than a showroom. Sarah was cooking dinner, real dinner, with fresh ingredients and the kind of care that comes from joy rather than obligation. Rebecca set the table with the precision of a little girl who took her responsibilities seriously, while Madison and Chloe argued over who got to put ice in the water glasses. "Uncle David," Rebecca said as she placed the last fork, "is the bad lady going to prison forever?" "For a very long time," David confirmed. "Long enough for you to grow up and have children of your own." "And Vincent?" David glanced toward the living room, where Vincent sat uncomfortably on the new couch. The restraining order had been modified to allow supervised visits with Madison and Chloe after he'd completed anger management and parenting classes. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a chance for him to become the father his daughters deserved. "Vincent is learning how to be better," David said diplomatically. Sarah appeared from the kitchen carrying a pot roast that smelled like heaven. "Dinner's ready." As they gathered around the table, David, Sarah, Rebecca, Madison, Chloe, and even awkwardly present Vincent, David felt a completeness he'd never experienced in all his years of business success. "Uncle David," Rebecca said as they held hands for grace, "I'm glad I called you." "I'm glad you did too, sweetheart." Even though it was really scary, David squeezed her small hand gently, especially because it was scary. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it most. 6 months later, Rebecca walked down the aisle of St. Mary's Church wearing a white dress that made her look like a princess. As the flower girl at David and Sarah's wedding, she carried white roses and wore a smile that could light up the entire world. Behind her came Madison and Chloe, giggling as they scattered rose petals with more enthusiasm than precision. In the front pew, Agent Ross dabbed at her eyes as she watched the little girl whose desperate phone call had helped solve a conspiracy that reached back generations. Vincent sat in the back row, having made remarkable progress in his therapy and relationship with his daughters. He would never win Father of the Year, but he was learning that love meant protecting rather than controlling. At the altar, David Thompson waited for his bride, surrounded by the family he'd found through the courage of a 7-year-old who refused to accept that hope was just a word in a phone. Sarah walked toward him, looking radiant in a simple white dress, her green eyes shining with tears of joy. "Do you, David, take Sarah to be your wife?" the pastor asked. "I do," David said, looking into the eyes of the woman who had kept his brother's memory alive through Rebecca's smile. "And do you, Sarah, take David to be your husband?" "I do," Sarah whispered, thinking of Marcus and knowing he would approve of the man who was about to become father to his daughter and husband to the woman he had loved. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Rebecca cheered loudly enough to make the entire congregation laugh. Later at the reception, she climbed onto David's lap during his speech. "Can I say something?" she asked into the microphone. "Of course, sweetheart." Rebecca looked out at the room full of family and friends, some biological, some chosen, all connected by the love that had grown from one desperate phone call. "I just want to say thank you to my Uncle David for answering the phone when I was scared," she said in her clear 7-year-old voice. "And thank you to my daddy Marcus, who I never got to meet, but who made sure Uncle David would take care of us. And thank you to Mama for being the best mama in the whole world." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. But Rebecca wasn't finished, and I want to tell all the other kids who might be watching that, if you're scared and you don't know what to do, sometimes calling for help is the bravest thing you can do, even if you don't know who's going to answer. The applause was thunderous, but David barely heard it. He was looking at his new wife, at his 3 daughters, because Madison and Chloe had asked if they could call him Daddy too, and feeling grateful for a 7-year-old's courage that had given him everything he'd never known he wanted. The Thompson fortune would belong to Rebecca, Madison, and Chloe now, administered by David and Sarah until the girls came of age. But they already had something more valuable than money. They had each other, and they had the unshakable knowledge that sometimes, when everything seems darkest, all it takes is one brave phone call to change the world forever.